What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and in this video I'm going to make you guys an expert on Dane Whitman, also known as the Black Knight, because he's going to be in the Eternals film. Here's the funny thing about this: Dane Whitman in the Eternals movie is probably going to be way more interesting than he's ever been in the comics. Although I will say, the Ebony blade and Merlin is really what made Dane Whitman cool when it came to Marvel Comics. So the idea behind this is that Dane Whitman first appeared in Avengers issue number 47 in 1967, and he was created by Roy Thomas and George Tuska. Now here's the thing about this: the popularity of Dane Whitman wasn't really so much Dane himself as it was the circumstances under which he was introduced, or at least the initial popularity he served. And that's going to be one of the reasons why, as we kind of go through this video, that he's a perfect example of a character that Marvel introduced who was really popular for a while and then dropped off. So the idea behind this is that Dane Whitman being introduced here was really just him and like a lab assistant named Norris. And the whole point is that they were basically messing with what were in effect electromagnetic waves in an effort to reach out and to basically gain at least some understanding of intelligent life that was out there, right? To kind of bridge the gap between humanity and alien races. Now, the reality is, a Fantastic Four have been doing this for quite some time, but in truth, at the time that Marvel was publishing these comics, the nature of things is that while the Fantastic Four were like spacefaring and they were going on adventures and things like that, they didn't really bring a lot of that stuff home, which is to say they weren't like introducing alien races to Earth on a regular basis. They would encounter them, but it wasn't like anything that you saw in the mid-2000s with like Annihilation Conquest, stuff like that. A lot of the early spacefaring escapades of Marvel were limited to like a handful of heroes and occasional contacts with alien races. And so the whole point behind this, the reason why this is important, is because during this time, Roy Thomas was actually in the process of leading up to what is probably one of the most important introductions of a villain in the history of Marvel Comics. And it all came back to what were basically the rebranded or recreated Masters of Evil. The idea here was that at the time, Magneto and Toad had basically been whisked away by a cosmic entity called the Stranger, who was really more of like a scientist than anything else, and the actions of Dane Whitman had unwittingly released Magneto and Toad, which led to them coming back to Earth and basically recreating the Masters of Evil. Now, of course, along the way, they defeated Dane Whitman and his lab assistant and so on and so forth. During that time, what you also saw was an explanation of Dane Whitman as it tied into the original Nathan Garrett, right, the first real Black Knight of the modern era. And here's an important thing to understand. So in 1955, Marvel introduced the Black Knight for the first time, but because of the fact that it was really more Atlas Comics as opposed to Marvel Comics, during the 1950s, what we could call Marvel basically told what were in effect stories involving like science fiction and like fantasy, things like that. It wasn't really superheroes as you see them today. And so the stories of Black Knight back then basically dealt with the stories of Sir Percival of Scandia, right? The actual mythological Black Knight that served alongside King Arthur. Now, later on, Nathan Garrett was introduced as the Black Knight, who was villainous and a member of the original Masters of Evil under Magneto, and was actually basically destroyed by Iron Man. But the way the origin story is told here with regards to Dane Whitman is that in the final moments of Nathan Garrett's death, he basically regretted all the villainous things he did and told Dane Whitman to kind of go forward and to actually take the mantle of Black Knight and to be a hero. And so what this did is that during this time with Magneto returning and so on, this was a story that ran into issue number 48, and then it ran all the way up into issue 53 and 54. Now, the reason why this is so important, and especially for those of you guys who have seen our video on it, issue number 54, the return of the Masters of Evil and all that kind of stuff, that dealt with a villain who was known as the Crimson Cowl. The real identity of the Crimson Cowl, where it was initially revealed to be Jarvis, the actual villain behind everything was Ultron. And so that was basically, it was really Black Knight being introduced along Roy Thomas's way to bringing Ultron into Marvel Comics. And that's why I say the introduction of Black Knight was more circumstantial. In reality, as far as I'm aware, Roy Thomas created Black Knight because he just wanted to expand the mythos, right? Just kind of expand the Avengers roster, introduce new things, which was par for the course back then, right? You saw it a lot when it came to different writers. But the important thing is that despite these early introductions, where you did see Dane Whitman actually aid the superheroes in essentially defeating the Crimson Cowl and so on, because they thought he was an actual villain, he just ended up taking off. Now, that was Roy Thomas's way of removing Black Knight from the Avengers team temporarily and giving us Marvel Superheroes number 17. And what Marvel Superhero 17 did is it actually gave us the backstory to the nature of the Black Knight, specifically involving Merlin, the Ebony blade, all that kind of stuff. And so what ended up happening is that where there was a castle that was inherited by Dane Whitman that he looked to simply just get rid of, once he was there, and he actually traveled there by tour bus, which is kind of weird. Once he was there, he felt this almost kind of feeling, right? He was compelled to explore the castle. Once he did, he came across basically what was kind of an urn of sorts, and when he lit it, it basically brought back the spirit of Sir Percy of Scandia. And Sir Percy basically gave him the whole explanation and simply saying that at some point in time, you had the nephew of King Arthur named Mordred who was looking to kill King Arthur and to conquer Camelot. And And so what ended up happening is that where Percival was introduced as what was kind of a buffoon on the front face, he would operate as the Black Knight behind the scenes and was actually probably the best of all the different knights, depending on who it is that you talk to. The issue with this is that Percival had arrived to the battle between Mordred and King Arthur after King Arthur was killed. And so where Percival was ultimately struck down, we ended up learning a few things happened. The first is that Merlin took the essence of the Percival family line, right? So all those individuals who would be born after Sir Percival of Scandia and tied it directly to the sword. So long as a person has the sword in their possession, they are in effect immortal, but there are a few caveats. The first is that because the sword, the ebony blade, was fashioned from a meteorite, a person who's wielding a weapon made of the same meteorite can kill a person who is wielding the ebony blade and can actually destroy the ebony blade itself. The second thing, and this is actually something that was changed more recently, the second thing is that the ebony blade itself had a kind of curse. Because the sword was basically used in battle, bloodlust, conflict, things like that, it kind of developed a mind of its own to a degree, a sort of curse, that as long as a person wielded it, the longer they wielded the sword, the more they would desire bloodlust and conflict. And so that's why you would see stories following this that we can kind of, mention in passing here, where Dane Whitman would actually kind of lose himself, where he would go into something akin to like a Wolverine or a Thor berserker rage, where he would just sort of lose his mind and just kind of become insane because the influence of the sword would override him to a degree. But the important thing here is that because of the fact that he is the next member in the Percival line, and because of the fact that this basically gives him the ability to go forward as the Black Knight in a more heroic fashion, he ended up taking the ebony blade and then basically returned to the Avengers. Now during that time, this was kind of interesting about this, at the time Marvel was in the process of creating the Defenders. Now as those of you guys know from our discussion on the Defenders, it was really just the result of the fact that like Doctor Strange's comics were canceled. They finished in a series of crossover stories which people loved, so Marvel gave us the Defenders in what was in effect kind of premiere comic, and then following that the Defenders got their own story. The other thing about this is Marvel was looking to expand out beyond the States, and as part of that they were kind of reshuffling the Marvel landscape at the time. Again, all this really taking place in the early 1970s going into the late 1970s. And so what you saw here was two things. The first is that Dane Whitman actually ended up becoming part of the initial Defenders team and then was basically defeated, right? Or at least, kind of put in stone by Enchantress herself. During that time, what Marvel did is they whisked his spirit away back to the days of the Crusades, and then he basically handed his horse Pegasus over to Valkyrie, which is how Valkyrie ended up getting the Pegasus horse. The other part of this, and I don't really know if this is true, I'm just kind of guessing here, there's really nothing to confirm this, because of the fact that Black Knight's history was tied into Sir Percival of Scandia, Arthurian legend, all of which really seem to be a hallmark of British history, that with Marvel looking to expand out into Marvel UK, which at the time were basically a series of just stories either involving new tales of Captain Britain or reprints of existing Marvel comics featuring Spider-Man and characters like that, that Marvel launched the Hulk UK. And so while this did, of course, deal with the Incredible Hulk, what you saw were a series of backup features that dealt with Dane Whitman in the aftermath of the events of Defenders. And that basically actually saw him being brought to the modern day in the body of a guy named Garrington, and then in turn going forward and helping Captain Britain, different things along those lines, traveling back to the days of Camelot, and then like helping to save it from Mordred, working, fighting alongside King Arthur, all that kind of stuff. It was kind of a test, I have to believe, that Marvel had, and asking the question, is it one of these things where Black Knight would be missed if we took him off the Avengers proper and we left him in Marvel UK, or does he better belong in Marvel UK, right? Is his popularity as it existed at the time enough to bolster our reach into the United Kingdom and to grab a lot of that UK audience by essentially telling stories that respect the mythology that they kind of grew up reading? Regardless of the situation, what you saw at the end of the Hulk Marvel UK run is you actually saw Dane Whitman brought back to the Avengers roster. Now, his initial return was one that was actually kind of fraught with conflict, not so much on the writing side, but the in-story side. And the reason for that is because while you did see the Defenders finding a way to return his spirit to his body, that the Avengers themselves hadn't gone on any kind of a mission to save Dane Whitman. And so the big issue he had, or really the big beef he had, was the Avengers basically just left him hanging. And so initially there was a bit of a skirmish there, but then following that, he would actually join the team. And in reality, if you tie in his involvement with Avengers 47 running up to the events of 54, it makes him one of the longest longest running members of the Avengers team as a whole. Now, here's the biggest issue that Dane Whitman faced. The reality was that during the Marvel UK stuff, that most of Dane Whitman's ongoing enemies and, Mordred, stuff like that, that was all largely resolved. There wasn't really a whole lot to deal with when it came to the Avengers team, and it kind of made sense. Given the, I wouldn't say lack of popularity, but given the fact that Marvel UK didn't really seem to grip audiences in the way that Marvel expected it to. Captain Britain was cool, Excalibur was cool when it came along later on, but outside of that, Dane Whitman just didn't really seem to have that kind of pull. When they brought him back onto the Avengers, it was kind of the same thing. People thought he was cool, but it wasn't one of these things where it's like people were racing to buy comics because it featured Dane Whitman. Dane Whitman was never on the same level as like Spider-Man or Captain America or Iron Man. These guys had really compelling stories. Ultimately, Dane Whitman didn't. And that was a result of a lot of people who just seemed to kind of write him incorrectly. But regardless of how you slice it, you saw a few things take place over there. The Ebony Blade always kind of seemed to be in the forefront. It was always one of these things of like, is this the issue where the Ebony Blade is going to finally corrupt Dane Whitman? Or where it was given to somebody like Marina, the wife of Namor the Submariner, who went crazy. Whatever the case happens to be, it's one of these things where there just wasn't a whole lot of emphasis there. Now, a lot of this went into 1988, and Marvel actually made one of the best decisions they possibly could. The reason why is because with issue number 297, that focused on the conclusion of all these different crazy cross-time capers featuring King the Conqueror, and the existing roster of the Avengers basically resigned. And so what Marvel did, because Dane Whitman was part of that, they wanted to kind of shuffle him around the Marvel landscape and see if there were just other stories that would be more compelling if they featured him. And so what they actually did is they had him work alongside Thor, where he would basically help to be a protector of Asgard and face off against the villain known as Seth. The problem with this is that no one really cared. So by the time you got to Thor issue number 400, that what ended up happening is Dane Whitman was basically just kind of stuck in the form of an inanimate statue when he was locked in stone again. And so going into 1990, Roy Thomas was brought back to kind of rework the Black Knight mythos to a degree, and it actually worked pretty well, to be honest with you guys. So it was basically Black Knight Volume 2, which was kind of the second iteration of a Black Knight solo series, as limited as it was. Again, like the original in 1955 was largely considered to be Volume 1, but the idea behind this was that you had a woman named Victoria Bentley. Now, Victoria Bentley was one of these characters that Marvel kind of teased could be super powerful, but they never really seemed to do a whole lot with. She'd been around since 1963, so it's not like she was new. She'd been around for quite some time. It was one of these things where her initial involvement actually dealt with Baron Mordo kidnapping her and then realizing how powerful she would be and then using her as a pawn to bring in Doctor Strange and so on and so forth. But Marvel just never really seemed to elevate her to any significant role. But the idea behind this was that because of the fact that Dane Whitman was locked in a stone form, he was sent back to his castle, he was tended to by Victoria Bentley, and then her attempt was to bring Dane Whitman back. What she actually ended up doing was placing the spirit of Sir Percy of Scandia in the body of Dane Whitman, which was actually an attempt by Roy Thomas to ask the question, would people want to see Sir Percy of Scandia instead, right? Does just no one care about Dane Whitman? The result is that people were interested in seeing Whitman, they just didn't really find him to be compelling in the stories as they were written at the time, which is a hugely important thing because in the 90s, Marvel would totally change Whitman up. But the idea behind this is that with Whitman being restored to his physical body after Sir Percy of Scandia just kind of leaves, he basically discorporates, Marvel did a couple different things. The most notable of this is they actually removed the idea of the bloodlust curse from the Ebony Blade in the sense that it was just kind of removed from the scenario as a whole. Following that and going into Avengers issue number 329, what you saw was kind of a sort of tease of slowly bringing Dane Whitman back as part of the Avengers. He wasn't fully thrown onto the team. Instead, you actually got some stories where he was more of kind of like the guy they hit up when no one else can show up. So really more of like a substitute member, if you want to call him that, like a reserve member or something along those lines. And then actually what you ended up seeing a little bit later on in Avengers issue number 343 is that he became a full-on member of the team. Now, this coincided directly with an event called Operation Galactic Storm. At the same time, in 343, Dane Whitman walked away from the Ebony Blade in its entirety because the curse was kind of re-emerging. Now, because of the fact that this was the 1990s and because the goal of Marvel was to create more fast-paced, high-octane stories, super high technology, things like that, then what you saw was Dane Whitman getting rid of the Ebony Blade and replacing it with what was in effect like a photon sword. It was really more akin to a lightsaber, if we're being honest with ourselves. But Operation Galactic Storm is probably one of the most important stories that has nothing to do with the Avengers and really has more to do with the Kree, right? And to kind of give you guys a little bit of an aside here, for those of you guys who are interested, the idea of the Kree race and the reason why they look the way they do is because there came a point when one of them managed to get their hands on an object that was called the Crystal of Ultimate Vision. The problem with this is that if you got your hands on the crystal and you intended to use it for nefarious purposes, it would freeze the evolutionary process of your race, which is exactly what happened to the Kree. The idea of Operation Galactic Storm was for the Supreme Intelligence, the leader of the Kree, to initiate a giant war with the Shi'ar race, which was really an empire that I think, in my mind, is actually bigger than the Kree themselves. But regardless, it wiped out like 99% of the Kree race, which jump-started their evolutionary process. That was kind of the significance of the entire event itself. But the funny thing about this is that the Supreme Intelligence was actually killed at the end of the story by Dane Whitman. So again, it was a pretty cool little involvement there to say like this guy is one involved in more spacefaring escapades. He's really more of a hero who can fight alongside the Avengers and like spacefaring events as opposed to just whatever Earth stuff happens to be. But then at the same time, it kind of boosted his popularity a little bit. The other thing that took place during this time, and is probably one of the more notable things to happen to Dane Whitman, even though it only lasted about 20 issues, was between Avengers 355 and 375. And this is when Dane Whitman basically became the Ganjosin for Sersi. The whole idea behind this is that the Eternals have their own customs, right? Their own situation, so on and so forth. By and large, the Eternals never really have dealings with humanity outside of the role assigned to them by the Celestials themselves, which is to say, Eternals don't usually date or associate with humanity in any real romantic way. You never really saw something play out the way that it did, where Sersi had actually chosen a human as what was basically her life mate, and that's the Ganjosin. Now, it's also the actual name of the ceremony, so it's like if you get married, right? Like you call it a wedding, but instead of calling the person you're with your husband or your wife, you call them you're wedded, right? Or you call it like you call them your wedding, right? It's the name of the ceremony, but also the name of the role that the person plays. Now, a lot of this has to do with what was going on in the Eternals comics at the time. The fact that Sersi was basically possessed. She wasn't really in total control of her faculties. It's not in the sense that like Dane Whitman manipulated her, but it was one of these things where Marvel had kind of crafted this love triangle. Now, truth to tell, it was one of these things where Marvel was trying to duplicate the popularity of the love triangle between like Wolverine, Cyclops, and Jean. It didn't work. No one wanted it. But the evolution of Dane Whitman as he lived with the Eternals was really cool because you saw him going on different adventures and things like that and fighting alongside the Eternals. And so during that point in time, I loved the character of Dane Whitman, and for reasons that I will never fully understand, Marvel threw him into the Ultraverse. Now, for those of you guys who don't know what that is, the Ultraverse was a line of comics that was created by a company called Malibu between 1993 and 1997. It was at the height of like the comic book collector market, right? Everybody was buying comics, hoping they would have a whole bunch of value later on down the line. This basically dealt with something called the Avengers Ultraforce crossover, which actually introduced the Lost Infinity Stone and the being Nemesis. None of that matters. If anybody ever tells you that it's cool or it's in continuity, they're lying. It was never cool and it was never in continuity. But the thing about this is that it was sort of based off the original Infinity Gauntlet story, right? The idea that Thanos had just kind of described the creation of the Infinity Stones as saying like, once upon a time there was a being and they were lonely, so they dispersed their essence into the stones and then it created everything in existence. Marvel used that as part of the Ultraverse Avengers crossover to say like that person was actually Nemesis and they existed in like this imprint in this alternate reality that was created by Malibu. It was kind of bad. The important thing here though is that you actually had Dane Whitman, who was basically written out of Marvel Comics and stayed in Ultraverse as part of the Ultraforce for quite some time, which ran as part of Ultraverse Unlimited, and by issue number 2 it was canceled and he was rolled back over into the main Marvel universe. And so going into the mid-1990s, there were a couple stories. The first one was Black Knight Exodus number 1, and the second one was actually a crossover event between Avengers, West Coast Avengers, X-Men Volume 2, and Uncanny X-Men called Blood Ties, and basically it had a couple things happening. The first thing is that Dane Whitman was thrown back into the past during the Crusades of his ancestor's body, Eobard Garrington, and actually ended up encountering Bennett Duperry, who would go on to become Exodus. But more so than that, he actually faced off against Apocalypse, which was kind of cool. The other part of this is that because of his time travel capers, because of the fact that his spirit had been like physically removed from his body and so on, it allowed Marvel to kind of nullify the Ganjosin that had been created between himself and Sersi. And this actually allowed Marvel to kind of roll him on to the Heroes for Hire. One of the downsides about this is that following the conclusion of the first run of Heroes for Hire, this series just never really recovered because fans were so mad about how it ended. And so in truth, by the time you got to the 1990s, and I would say this is probably reminiscent of multiple titles that Marvel had at the time, the Heroes for Hire kind of felt like the island of misfit toys. That's where you would shuffle characters off to until you figured out what you wanted to do with them. Sometimes it would just be writing them out and they would just be gone forever. Other times they would just kind of move them on to something else. For the character of Dane Whitman, Marvel had actually moved him on to the Avengers and Excalibur. At first it was Excalibur Volume 2 with issues 1 through 4, and then eventually you got to New Excalibur with issues 10 through 15. And the reason why this was important is because you saw him kind of engaging in some time travel escapades where he would travel to the past, he would travel to the present. It was a point where he helped Merlin fight some dragons. But what ended up happening is he went on kind of a personal quest to hunt for what was basically the Ebony Blade. And Marvel removed him from the landscape for like a decade, right? He was gone for 10 years. The funny thing about this is that by the time he got to the mid 2000s, so about 2006 running up to about 2008, while we have talked about this before in kind of the great reshuffling under Joe Quesada, that Dane Whitman was brought back, but this guy was a pinball. He was just bouncing all over the place, right? He was just everywhere, all over the place. He was part of Captain Britain. He was part of Euroforce, which was a really weird kind of team and series of events that took place. The whole thing behind this though is that Marvel never knew what to do with this guy, right? Marvel never knew where to put him or how to handle him or anything like that. He would appear here, he would appear there, and that would basically be it. But in truth, when you had events like Secret Invasion and stuff like that, he didn't play any massive roles in this. The funny thing is that even more recently it's been the case, right? Running from the mid 2000s up until now, there haven't really been any major stories involving the Black Knight. If anything, the stories that you see him in are really more reminiscent of the early Avengers stories he was in, where he was just kind of there and he would do some stuff and then like the day would be saved and that would be it. One of the more notable things that happened is that one, as part of Jason Aaron's Avengers run, he was in possession of the Phoenix Force for a time, but then of course ended up losing it. And in fact, it was kind of crazy because he ended up facing off against the Red Widow and she's the one that took him out. At the same time, what you also got during Donny Cates' run on Venom as part of the King in Black event is you got this adjustment to the nature of the Ebony Blade. And it was kind of a cool thing. It's by no means significant, right? This is not a game changer. If anything, I imagine Marvel probably did it because of the fact that the Eternals movie's coming out and it's just a small modification designed to bring the character of Black Knight more in line with the Eternals film, whatever form it's going to take as far as this character evolution and progress goes. But the whole thing behind this is that where the Ebony Blade was believed to have a curse that whoever wielded it would basically become more bloodlusted the stronger they became. Instead, when you had Black Knight, who was essentially spoken to by Null the symbiote god, right? The main villain behind the King in Black storyline, the guy trying to conquer the world and the universe and everything, that what he said is it doesn't actually work that way. That Merlin had really lied to Dane Whitman himself, which kind of made sense because Merlin had always sort of been a pretty duplicitous guy. What's told to Dane Whitman is that the curse of the sword, or the nature of the sword, is that it brings out all the negative emotions of the person who's wielding it. In a lot of ways, it made a lot more sense as opposed to like the original curse. The original curse is cool and it's kind of a hallmark of the character, but it makes more sense to say that the sword just draws on the negative emotions of its wielder and just drives them to become the darker version of themselves. Now, of what value that has and what significance it has, we don't know, because literally that story just ended. So I have no idea what's going to go on with the future of Dane Whitman in Marvel Comics. In reality, I would say the future of Dane Whitman in the comic book landscape is really going to depend on what they do with him in the movies, right? Like if they, have his story just go off in a totally different direction from what you saw in the comics, then the new comic stories will follow that. Whereas if the movie depiction is more in line with the comic book stories, then you'll find the direction that Dane Whitman goes in will be more in line with his old school comic stuff, right? In this day and age, the comics follow the movies, not really the other way around. So with that being said, guys, we're going to bring this to an end. Thank you guys for watching, and I will catch you all later. Peace.